Neil Gaiman's literary career has spanned journalism, novels, screenplays, graphic novels and comic books, winning plaudits and awards in many of these fields for his surrealist yet direct form of raw storytelling. However, one creation above any other will define this man throughout his career, one he began work on when he was just 28 years old, and a point when he was still a relatively unknown writer who'd moved between several publishers, building a small but impressive portfolio that attracted the attention of DC Comics. His second work for them, following a limited series Black Orchid, was The Sandman, an ongoing series that ran for 6 years across 76 issues, winning a World Fantasy Award and becoming one of the only graphic novels to do so, as the rest of the literary world was so aghast that a comic book could dare qualify to call itself a short story. And the series is regularly hailed as one of the greatest graphic novels ever produced. It was sold as a horror fantasy book, definitively not for children, as it features nudity, violence, torture, both physical and mental, and a host of other adult concerns. It does this in a tender, raw, honest way that neither glorifies or condemns the subject matter, save to acknowledge that cruelty and avarice are as much a part of the human condition as kindness and love. The main character, Morpheus, the personification of dreaming, is an unknowable entity who barely appears at all in the first issue, though his presence dominates everything that occurs. The concept of writing a story in dreams using the Sandman character belonged wholly to Neil Gaiman, but it was DC's British liaison, Karen Berger, who insisted he use a new character rather than rely on existing DC stock. I was surprised, as someone who picked up this book years after the fact, to discover that it's set within the DC universe, and the world that Morpheus walks when he picks his way through the Sea of Dreams is the same one that Batman and Superman inhabit. The crossover potential was vast, but, for a multitude of reasons, rarely offered their full potential in this original run. There are fleeting appearances from John Constantine, Scott Free, and the Martian Manhunter, but largely, Neil Gaiman, as an outside voice in the DC Comics universe, was left to pick at the obscure characters. He tried to incorporate larger appearances from people like the Joker, but he was told at the last minute that there were plans for the character in the main Batman line, and he was not to appear in anything for 6 months whilst this played out. Personally, I think this is for the best, as the appearances from the DC heavyweights tend to ground and muddy the story that Dream is weaving. Writer Neil Gaiman works best when given free rein over his creations. This was the first ongoing series that Gaiman, artist Sam Keefe, colourer Robbie Bush or inker Mike Drinkenberg had ever worked on. David McKean, a previous collaborator of Gaiman's, provided the cover art, successfully arguing to the publisher that the protagonist need not appear regularly, if hardly ever, on the front page in order to sell the comic. The story they were weaving was one of grand ideas, a complete rewriting of human storytelling history, and the art should complement the ethereal nature of the inhuman protagonist, both in their striking beauty and terror. The conceptual pitch was sold to DC with the image of a man locked in a cage, silent and patiently waiting for his captors to age and die so that the immortal could earn his freedom. The first issue then tells the story of Dream's imprisonment from the perspective of his captors, a secret society that waxes and then wanes with the passing years, a split separating the treasures stolen from Dream and scattering them across the continents. Dream's imprisonment is also indicated to have fundamentally broken, or at least altered, the human condition since the 19th century, with an array of terrible phenomena, cruel twists of fate, or even explaining the presence of other mortal protagonists who previously adopted the title of the Sandman and had featured in previous DC comics through the 1970s and 80s. Neil Gaiman sets up plot threads in the first issue which would take years to unravel, but there is a brilliant subtlety to his form of storytelling. Dream is presented as one of the endless, immortal representations of the human spirit, but his brothers and sisters barely feature in the first 6 issues. Once Dream achieves his freedom, he finds himself terribly weakened by the loss of his tools, and so the story of this first arc begins as a quest to regain his powers by hunting down 3 trinkets: the helm, his ruby, and a pouch of sand. These require him to consult with occultist hero John Constantine to retrieve the sands from an unfortunate wretch, a trip into the depths of hell to battle for his helmet, and an encounter with this previously somewhat obscure villain, Dr. Destiny, which may well be the best single example of psychological horror Gaiman was crafting. Issue 6 was simply titled 24 Hours, and it stars John Dee observing the regular patrons of a 24-hour diner gathering for breakfast at the start of a new day. Dee uses the ruby, stolen from Dream, to prevent the other patrons from leaving, and he begins to twist their minds, their very sanity, for his own amusement. He sparks conflict and violence, makes them reveal their dark and twisted secrets, killing them off one by one as his games break his toys beyond repair. At the end of the issue, Dream arrives at the diner looking haggard and broken, a grim stare as he faces down the man who has stolen and abused power not his by right. Sam Keefe had departed the comic by this point, so Mike Drinkenberg had stepped up to pencil the artwork, and he used this issue to vividly depict the madness of John Dee in the most unflinching way possible. The horror is not in the imagery, however, but the psychology of the piece, the way that these terrible events are woven into normal, civilian men and women's very lives. Though this is the DC comic universe, the Sandman has no interest in stories about superheroes or grand villains, and though Dee and Dream do have a grand face-off, the real story is about how our lives twist and turn in our own private narratives whilst the world moves on, barely noticing. Collateral damage is a common occurrence in these genres, and by widening the protagonist to represent the sum of all of humanity's delusions, Gaiman narrows in on individual people, normal men and women trapped just as much by their own lives as the events they've sadly wandered into. The first anthology concludes with issue 8, which is simultaneously the slowest but most meaningful of the set. Having completed his set task of recovering his tools, his sources of power, Dream pauses to reflect upon his ordeal. As an immortal, eternal being, he seems discomforted by the very concept he was able to be hurt. And though he's back to full strength, the entire ordeal has not sat easily on his shoulders. The antidote to his melancholy is a visit from one of his siblings, and Gaiman provides our first glimpse of the other Eternals in this franchise in the form of his older sister, Death. As far as anthropomorphic personifications of death go, I'm always going to be a sucker for the dry, sardonic wit of Terry Pratchett's Grim Reaper. And given Pratchett and Gaiman had known each other for 5 years at this point, and they were working on a joint novel together in the form of Good Omens, which was released in May, just 6 months after the Sandman had begun printing, this depiction of death is a completely different take, though just as beautiful in its own right. Gaiman has alluded to the idea that all cultures and creeds will perceive the endless differently. They're not people with genders or races, but concepts and ideas. So whilst modern civilization sees Dream as a gaunt, pale man, he has in the past had many different forms and faces. The modern Death is a pale, small young woman, someone who finds it easy to empathise with the toil and drudgery of humanity, but is resolute in her duty to collect the newly departed to the great beyond. It's touching moments like these, the bond of family between Morpheus and Death, the twisted delight as Dr. Destiny toys with his prisoners in the diner, the glum acceptance of inevitability of Constantine as he faces a creature infinitely more powerful and more inevitable than anything he's ever faced before, that powers Gaiman's writing. Preludes and Nocturnes has several of these scenes, but arguably spends too much time laying down the foundations for events yet to come. At the end of this book, Morpheus thinks he's recovered from his imprisonment, that he's returned to full strength after a century of torment. But in reality, the world has changed in his absence, and his doom has already begun to write itself into existence. But that, as they say, is another story.